The walls didn't just hold men, they swallowed them whole. Iron Ridge Correctional Facility stood like a scar on the earth, gray, jagged, and godless. Built atop an abandoned coal mine, the prison was isolated by miles of dead forest and frozen marsh. No birds flew near it. No wildlife dared linger in its shadow. Locals called it the pit, but those inside simply called it hell. Every inch of the prison reeked of sweat, bleach, and decay. The kind of stench that sunk into your skin and never left. Cells were stacked like concrete coffins, each barely large enough to lie down in. Lights buzzed without blinking. Cameras watched without rest. And the guards, hardened men who had long since forgotten the difference between authority and cruelty, kept order with batons, fists, and the silent threat of disappearing into Sea Wing. That's where they sent the worst of the worst, or those they claimed were. Jackson Vey sat on the concrete floor of his Sea Wing cell, his back against the wall, arms wrapped around his knees. He didn't speak. Not to the guards, not to the other inmates. Not anymore. He'd been in Iron Ridge for 18 months, though it felt like decades. Time didn't pass here. It crawled, dragging sanity behind it like a wounded dog. Jackson wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this prison. Not in this wing. At least that's what he told himself every night before sleep teased the edge of his mind, only to be chased away by screams echoing down the halls. Before Iron Ridge, he'd been a literature professor at a mid-sized university. Clean record, soft voice, a man whose closest brush with violence was a heated academic debate about Dostoevsky. He had a wife, a daughter. He used to read them poems at night. Blake, Dickinson, sometimes his own. Now, the only verse he heard was the muttering of inmates unraveling in the dark. So what was he doing in a maximum security prison, marked as a danger to society? A fire, a dead colleague, a closed casket funeral. They said Jackson killed her, said he locked her in his office, poured gasoline, and lit the match. The trial had lasted 6 days. The prosecution called it premeditated, cold-blooded. They had grainy security footage, a mysterious insurance policy in Jackson's name, and an anonymous witness. It all sounded airtight. Too airtight. Jackson had no memory of the day it happened. He woke up in a holding cell with blood under his fingernails and the smell of smoke still clinging to his clothes. He remembered arguing with her a week before about academic misconduct, about lies. But murder? It didn't fit. It never fit. The judge called it one of the most calculated acts of vengeance he'd ever seen. The press turned it into a frenzy. The Professor Pyro, they called him. By the time he arrived at Iron Ridge, half the prison knew his nickname. The other half didn't care. Everyone had blood on their hands in here. His just smelled like ash. What really haunted Jackson, more than the sentence, more than the loss of his career and family, was the not knowing. Was he capable of it? Could grief and betrayal have snapped something inside him? Some nights he convinced himself the system had failed him. Other nights, he wasn't so sure. The cell lights flickered once. Shift change. A low clang followed as the steel door opened and a new guard stepped in. Big, bored, already chewing gum. He tossed a metal tray through the slot without a word. The food was always the same: lukewarm beans, stale bread, and something pretending to be meat. Jackson didn't touch it. Instead, he stood slowly, stretching limbs that hadn't known comfort in weeks. He moved like a ghost, careful and quiet, as if the walls might crack from sudden motion. He crossed the room and stared into the polished steel mirror bolted to the wall. The face staring back barely looked human. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, beard grown wild. But the worst was the eyes, eyes that asked a question they were afraid to answer. A scream tore through the wing, followed by frantic banging on metal. Jackson didn't flinch. Someone else was breaking tonight. He turned back to the wall, sliding down to the floor. Above him, scratched into the concrete, were the words, "You are not what they say you are." He hadn't carved it. It had been there when he arrived, like a message from a former ghost. Or maybe a warning, maybe a lie. Outside, the wind howled like a dying animal, but in here, The silence screamed louder. Jackson closed his eyes and for the briefest moment imagined a different world. A warm kitchen, a child's laughter, the smell of fresh coffee and old books. Then the memory faded, devoured by the dark. Tomorrow, the guard said he was being moved. Special protocol, they called it. No one explained what that meant. But at Iron Ridge, nothing special ever ended well. The next morning began with silence. No guards' boots, no clanging doors, not even the usual morning scream from down the hall. Jackson awoke to stillness, the kind that didn't belong in Iron Ridge. And then, like a knife through calm, came the voice, "Faye, on your feet." He didn't argue. You didn't argue in Iron Ridge. You moved, or you were moved. Two guards stood at his cell door, both wearing expressionless faces and black gloves. One held shackles, the other held a black canvas hood. They didn't say where he was going, and Jackson didn't ask. He knew the drill. No answers, no explanations. Only pain. They escorted him through a maze of corridors, deeper than he'd ever been, past the sea wing, past even the death row blocks. The air grew colder, thicker. They stopped before a door marked S13. Solitary. He didn't resist when they strapped his wrists to the wall, didn't flinch when the hood was yanked off. The cell was the size of a walk-in closet. No windows, no bed, no toilet, just a hole in the ground. The walls were stained with something darker than mildew. The floor was damp. The only light came from a single bulb above, flickering erratically. 23 hours a day, one of the guards said, as if reading a grocery list. Food comes when it comes. You speak, you don't eat. You sleep during the day, we wake you. You scream, we make sure you scream louder. Welcome home. The door slammed shut with a finality that made Jackson's chest tighten. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the absence of time. Minutes became hours. Hours bled into days. There were no clocks, no human voices. The silence was unnatural, pressing in like water over a drowning man. You could scream, but it would just be swallowed by concrete. The guards liked it that way. The first day, Jackson tried to count. He pressed his back against the wall and tapped his fingers to keep rhythm. 100 seconds, 100 more. It kept his mind from unraveling. On day 3, they cut his rations. A handful of uncooked rice, no water. His lips cracked. His tongue felt like sandpaper. Still, no words. Jackson wouldn't give them the satisfaction. They started banging on the door at random times. Metal on metal, loud enough to pierce bone. Sometimes they'd turn on the light for just a second, then off again. Other times they'd leave it on for hours, humming and stinging in his eyes until they watered. Sleep became impossible. Days passed without rest, without dreams. Only wakefulness, raw and jagged. By day 6, his hallucinations began. The walls seemed to breathe. Faces appeared in the chipped paint, mouths moving in silence. His daughter's voice whispered to him from the drain in the floor. Sometimes it was his wife. Sometimes it was the woman who died in the fire asking him why he did it, or worse, why he didn't remember. The worst was when he smelled the smoke again, like the fire had followed him down here. One evening, he thought it was evening anyway. The door opened. A new guard stepped in. Short, thick, with a grin like a butcher who liked his work. He didn't say anything, just held out a metal tray and dropped it on the ground. Jackson crawled to it. Bread. Moldy. No water. He was about to eat when the guard spit in it. Jackson froze. The guard leaned in, voice low. "You think you're better than the rest of these animals, don't you? Professor Pyro? Fancy words? You think fire makes you a man?" Jackson didn't respond. "I asked you a question." Still, silence. The next second was pain, a boot in the ribs, then another. Jackson crumpled, breath knocked out of him. The guard laughed. "You'll break. They all break." He left, slamming the door behind him. Jackson didn't eat the bread. The next few days blurred. He lost track of time completely. He began muttering to himself without realizing it. Words from poems, snippets of lectures. He saw his daughter's face in the concrete again. He tried to remember her name and couldn't. That's when he cried. Silent, hot tears that burned more than the beatings. They let him out for 1 hour a day, to pace in a tiny yard surrounded by 20-foot walls and barbed wire. No sun, just gray sky. Sometimes they didn't let him out at all. Other times they blasted sirens during that hour so he couldn't think. It wasn't just punishment. It was erasure. They weren't trying to make him hurt. They were trying to make him disappear from himself. But somewhere inside him, past the numbness and hunger and fear, a sliver of him clung on. Not out of hope, not out of courage, but defiance. He wouldn't give them his mind. Not yet. Not completely. When they finally pulled Jackson from solitary, he couldn't walk straight. His knees buckled as the guards yanked him down the hall, his legs unfamiliar with movement, like thawed branches after a long freeze. His beard was matted, his skin pale and thin like rice paper. He didn't speak, didn't look anyone in the eye. They moved him to D-Wing, general population. "Congratulations," one of the guards muttered. "Welcome back to the zoo." The zoo, it turned out, was generous phrasing. The air in D-Wing was thicker than solitary, but not with silence, with tension, with rage, the kind that hung between men like invisible wire. One wrong word, one prolonged stare, and it snapped. And when it snapped, someone bled. Cells here were shared, 2 men in a space meant for one. No privacy, no safety. Jackson's new cellmate was a slab of muscle named Red, tattoos covering his arms, face pockmarked from fights long lost. Red didn't ask questions. He didn't even speak for the first 2 days. Just stared, occasionally sharpening a toothbrush against the wall. Jackson kept to himself. Head down, quiet. But prison didn't allow for passive existence. Fights broke out constantly, during mealtimes, in the showers, in the yard. Not random violence, but carefully orchestrated chaos. The guards rarely intervened, some even watched, bet on it. Jackson saw it happen. 2 inmates ordered to fight in the laundry room while a trio of officers stood by, sipping coffee, placing cash on the table. Even worse were the corrective lessons. If an inmate stepped out of line, disrespected the wrong person, or simply annoyed a guard, punishment came swiftly and brutally. Beatings in the dead of night, staged accidents, the suicides everyone knew weren't. Jackson tried not to see. He ate quietly. He avoided eye contact. But violence always found a witness. One afternoon in the yard, he watched a man get stabbed for cutting in line for basketball. The shank was crude, broken spoon with tape, but effective. The attacker hit him again and again, blood spraying across concrete like spilled ink. The guards let it play out before dragging the man's body away like trash. Jackson couldn't sleep that night. The sound of flesh being pierced wouldn't leave his ears. He started to shake. He began losing time. Sometimes he'd blink and find himself in the corner of the common area, unaware how he got there. Or he'd wake up and find messages carved into his mattress, words he didn't remember writing. "She's still burning. You are the fire. Wake up." He stopped trusting his thoughts. The hallucinations from solitary crept back in. He'd hear his daughter humming behind the cell door. He saw shadows that didn't move like people. Sometimes, in the bathroom mirror, he'd see someone else's face looking back. He was slipping. Red noticed. One night, Jackson found him sitting on the edge of the bunk, staring straight ahead. "You keep twitching in your sleep," Red said. "Saying names. You better lock that down." "I can't help it," Jackson murmured. "You better learn," Red replied, "or this place'll finish what it started." For a moment, there was silence. Then Red added softer, "Ain't nobody coming to save you here." Jackson believed that. He knew that. And then, something unexpected happened. A letter. It arrived during mail call, a once-a-week affair that usually ended with Jackson receiving nothing. He almost didn't notice when his name was called. He stepped forward slowly, hands trembling as the guard shoved a folded envelope into his palm. No return address, just his name. And inside, one sentence, handwritten. "You are not what they say you are." The same words carved into his solitary wall. His breath caught. He read it again. Again. For the first time in months, Something moved in his chest, something other than fear or bitterness. A flicker of clarity, of connection. He didn't know who had sent it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone was toying with him. Or maybe, just maybe, someone knew what he didn't, knew the truth. He hid the letter under his mattress. From that moment, the world didn't change, but he did. He started reading again, trading for books through the inmate network. Poetry at first, then journals, psychology, case studies, anything to engage his mind, to anchor himself. He scribbled notes in the margins with a stub of pencil, clinging to knowledge like rope in a flood. His mind fought to stay sharp, to stay his. The hallucinations lessened. The whispers grew quieter. He began recognizing himself in the mirror again, not fully, not yet, but enough. Red noticed that too. "You're climbing out of that hole," he muttered one day. "Not many do." "I'm not out," Jackson said. "Just digging in a different direction." Red chuckled. "Long as you don't start preaching." But something else shifted. Jackson started listening to the voices around him, stories, rumors, details about guards, about staff, about how